Today we're going to talk about understanding the Residential Tenancies Act, the simple version of what you need to know between landlords and tenants in Ontario. Hello everyone, my name is Andrew, and if you're watching this video, chances are you're the landlord or tenant who's looking to get into some kind of rental property and needs to understand a few things about your rights and responsibilities. So to start, we're going to be covering questions like, what is the Residential Tenancies Act? The basics that you need to know as a landlord and tenant that will cover 90% of most landlords and tenants and things that they need to know. And then we're also going to talk about making agreements outside the Residential Tenancies Act. And then we're going to talk about what happens if a disagreement arises that may fall into gray areas. And lastly, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for both landlords and tenants, so make sure to stick around for that. So let's start off with the first and foremost thing, which is, what is the Residential Tenancies Act? Well, the Residential Tenancies Act is basically an act that governs the relationship between landlords and tenants, and it is in place to set out rules and responsibilities for both landlords and tenants in case any disagreements arise. It is there to outline fundamental laws, rights and responsibilities of both landlords and tenants, rent rules, because rent is very important, as well as policies that exist as far as it goes towards leading to the landlord and tenant board. Now, within that bigger question of what is the Residential Tenancies Act, there is the question of, does the act apply to me? Whether you're a landlord or a tenant, you might want to ask this questions, and there's an easy way to consider this, and that is pretty simply, do I as a tenant or a landlord share a kitchen and or bathroom with the other person? You are considered a roommate and you are not thereby under the protection of the Residential Tenancies Act. Here's what you need to know about rent increases. Landlords are only allowed to increase the rent once per year, and notice has to be given 3 months in advance. And you're not allowed to arbitrarily increase the rent however much you want unless your unit is built or has not been rented prior to 2018, and you generally have to follow the rent increase guideline, which is given every year by the government. And there are certain exceptions to this where you can both agree to certain rent increases, like let's say the landlord decides to upgrade something and then the tenant agrees to pay an increase in the rent. That is something that can be done. Now, eviction, something that needs to be clearly understood is that eviction is a very specific term. Landlord cannot evict tenants. Evictions can only be done by a sheriff, and if that is happening, it's because due process has already been completed. Now, let's talk about moving out of the property. The question that some people ask is, how can I break my lease as a tenant, or am I allowed to just move out of the property if I don't want to stay there anymore? Now, generally speaking, the rule is that you can terminate your tenancy after your lease has expired, and you have to, as a tenant, give a full 2 months notice. Now, on the flip side, can a landlord terminate the tenant's lease before the term is up? It's better to just assume no, you have to wait until the lease term is up. Next thing I want to talk about is agreements outside the RTA. Now, a lot of people will lean on this one thing that they heard one time, which is that you cannot force a tenant to give you post-dated checks or set up direct debit through their banking. And this is true, you're not allowed to force them, but you can agree to it. There's nothing wrong for me as a landlord to ask you as a tenant who's going to be renting my property if you consent to this, and you to say yes or no. It is not that it is illegal, it is that you cannot force somebody to do this if they don't want to. And I think that's fair. Now, if a disagreement arises, what are you supposed to do? As a tenant or landlord, you can take one or the other to the landlord and tenant board and go through that process. I generally don't recommend doing that because it's a mess. Most of the time, it is better to try to work things out before attending the landlord and tenant board. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about here, which I promised at the beginning, is I want to tell you some tips and tricks for you as a landlord or a tenant to know when trying to navigate this whole situation and resolve problems without escalation. If you are a tenant and you are looking to terminate your tenancy early, a tenant can go about subletting their apartment or assigning their lease agreement to somebody else. And if the landlord fails to do one of two things, which is either acknowledge this or they refuse to accept or approve the tenancy, the tenant is now able to terminate their tenancy ahead of time. And I see a lot of tenants using this as a means to get out of their lease if they are in a property that they don't want to stay, or they're having some disagreement with the landlord that they don't want to try to resolve or figure it out or correct, and they just want to walk away from the situation and clean their hands and move on to something new. Now, I also want to talk about some gray areas in the RTA. The RTA, for example, has this one broad statement, which is that the landlord is responsible to maintain the property in a state of reasonable functionality in the way that it was given. And there are some circumstances where, let's say if there was a dishwasher there, you may have not stated that there is one in the lease agreement. However, if there was a dishwasher there that was functioning, you now have an obligation to maintain it. And then there comes other areas where it says that if some things were part of regular wear and tear, am I as a landlord responsible to maintain it? Let's say if a light bulb is burnt out, do I have to go change it? And that is where things become gray. There's a lot of gray areas that are left to interpretation communication. And this is why I tell people that it's better to just work around these things and try to figure things out so that you can both move on with things. The next tip or trick I want to give to both landlords and tenants, if you're on a lease agreement, sometimes what I've seen done is this. If I want to terminate my lease 6 months early, and then on the 5th month, I'm like, how am I going to do this? I may decide to just not pay rent on the 6th month, probably going to serve me with an N4, the form that you serve to a tenant if the tenant has not paid rent. And you're essentially saying, I am going to terminate my lease agreement because you haven't paid rent. And this is meant to be threatening. Now, if you look at this form, it actually has a section there where it says that you need to either move out by this date, and it also says in there that this is the termination date, or pay the rent. But you see, I want to move out by the 6th month anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fail to pay rent, you're going to serve me with this notice, and I'm going to be a good person, I'm going to follow your instruction and move out by the term that you indicated in your N4. And then landlords are like, oh, well, I didn't really want to terminate my tenant's lease, I actually just wanted them to pay their rent. Do not try to chase people who have nothing to give. And for tenants, do not be abusive of the system, because it's really there to protect the interests of landlords and tenants. And in many cases, what I see is that if you tell your landlord that you have to move for some reason and you want to assign or sublet the property, that is way more reasonable than trying to manipulate the circumstances and play these games with each other. So what am I trying to say here is that the RTA is a good act that is there to protect the interests of both parties. However, you can still conduct yourselves outside of it and make very simple agreements that people tend to make and have made for a very long time. So I hope this video was helpful for you. If you have any more questions about landlord and tenant related matters, make sure to drop a comment or contact us via some information in the description below. As always, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and I will see you on the next one.